Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and this is going to be a brief little discussion video on Psychopaths, Episode 8. We're pretty much picking up right where we left off, with Oso Academy being on lockdown, this because girls have gone missing, and essentially the enforcers, Akane, Ganoza, all of them, suspect that this is where everything leads to. You know, this is where people have gone missing from, and one of the suspects in the previous specimen case basically comes from this academy. So, of course, they're canvassing the entire area, and we basically open with this really intriguing discussion between the two villains, if you will, Rikako Oryo and Makishima, the nemesis of this series, where basically she outlines this whole sort of distaste for what she sees as a stagnant and archaic molding of young impressionable girls' minds into this sort of processed, happy housewife that they later become. And I think this is really interesting because it is somewhat a feminist viewpoint, but it also speaks to the irony in her targeting these girls, these students who are her own peers, for slaughter and subsequent artistic expressionism that she sees fit to put forth. It definitely seems to touch on the word psycho in the title Psychopaths, if you will. But of course, Makishima himself seems not all that impressed by this. It seems like the beginning snowflakes of his disinterest in her are effectively snowballing into somewhat of a torrent by the end of this episode. As we check back in with the enforcers, we see that they're very much on the ball as well, because they're thinking outside the box when it comes to the established construction of the academy, which is over 100 years old, and how certain blueprints could get lost or, screwed up and stuff like that, and there could be places for somebody to hide on this campus. And I love that because this all touches on that very fact, which was confirmed to us, the viewer, when we saw Oreo going into a secret area which was no longer on the blueprints in the previous episode. On top of that, we really get some good insight into Kagami's skills as a profiler, an enforcer, and an investigator in this episode. And this is really something that Akane seems to be impressed by as well. Of course, she's following up on her orders via Ganoza in the previous episode to stick closely to Kagami, because essentially Kagami's been ordered off this case. He's got all that history with his partner having been killed in the original specimen case, and if this ties back to that, well, Ganoza doesn't want to risk the chance of Kagami's crime coefficient going through the roof, so he wants him kept away from it. But with Kagami being the ever-vigilant investigator that he is, he has this whole line of sort of detective's reasoning as far as why he suspects this isn't to do with the same suspect they had for the specimen case. And he outlines this sort of brilliant line of thinking that it's all down to the aesthetic, that these artistic displays featuring the murdered girls are really kind of boring, Essentially, there's no real humor to them, or there's no grand message being sent with each of them when they appear, whereas in the former case, that was very much what the murderer was going for. And add to that Kagami's ability to type all of these parameters into a computer and kind of come out with the average age and financial means of the prospective murderer, or even perchance their backer, which of course plays on that whole thing, because of course we know that this killer is Rikako Oryo and that her backer is this guy Makishima. And to me, this really lends further credence to the comparison I made in my previous video between Sherlock Holmes and his all-time nemesis Moriarty, and that relationship dynamic that's unfolding between Kagami and Makishima. They are both equally matched where wits are concerned, if this episode is any indication, and it just ramps up my excitement because of course we know, per that flash forward at the beginning of episode 1, that their rivalry will eventually come to a sort of fruition, and I just can't wait to see that unfold as these episodes continue. Now, with all that said, as skilled as Kagami is, he still needs further information to lock this particular investigation down. So he and Akane go to press this criminal in the Tokorozawa Correction Center, who himself is somewhat of an artistic masochist. He has a history with this sort of disgusting stuff, and as soon as he sees the artistic expressions being carried out by Rikako Oryo, he associates it with her father. Now, this is the information Kagami needs, and I love how on the coattails of receiving this, he just marches right into the academy, blatantly ignoring all of his previous orders, and it just sends all the other enforcers into a flurry because he's not supposed to be there. Now, thanks to the untimely intervention from the academy's principal and one of Makishima's assistants, Oryo gets away, but I won't necessarily say that she doesn't get her just desserts. Now, as a result of this, while she's gone missing, they do find the two bodies of the last two missing girls, and it's all part of this big display, the final display, if you will, of Oryo herself. I have to admit to being somewhat surprised that we didn't see a greater sense of conflict between Ganoza and Kagami when he showed up on scene in defiance of his orders, and add to that had this whole other line of reasoning, this line of investigation, pointing to a different suspect altogether than the group has been looking for up to that point. But I do have to wonder if maybe this hints to Nose is coming to respect Kagami's investigation skills. I'm sure we'll see more of this as episodes unfold. Not to be outdone by Kagami's skills, Makishima shows just how deft he is when he hacks the campus security cameras and destroys all the footage pertaining to the art room, which was primarily the meeting place for he and Oreo, where they had all their conversations and stuff like that. Not to be outdone, though, giving us another example of just how equally matched he is with Makishima, Kagami manages to restore the audio at least from some of these files, and he not only manages to get Makishima's name, but he also happens to catch Oreo's confession of killing these girls. And while Rikako Oreo goes unarrested by the end of this episode, she's certainly not without her punishment at the hands of Makishima himself, who, as I said earlier, those snowflakes of disinterest have now snowballed into a torrent of disappointment. And by the end of this, while we see that she meets a sort of gruesome, cruel end, it's really only the beginning for him, because now he's set his sights on someone new, Kagami. And there we have that interesting dynamic just beginning in this series, and I couldn't be more excited. Now, one standout moment that I want to reference has to do with one of the other enforcers, the only other female on the group, Yayoi, I believe is her name, where essentially she's comforting the friend of one of the murdered girls, and she tells this girl to let out her feelings, to cry freely, because essentially if she doesn't, this could cloud her mind and make her criminal coefficient raise and stuff like that. And I just thought it was a really poignant and moving moment, and it just shined a spotlight on this other enforcer that we really haven't seen being as active in other stories up until this point. And I guess I should also issue bonus points for that little description that Kagami gives to Akane about the guy whose brain was shucked out of his skull and the hippocampus to do with his memory, being that in interviews he proclaimed not remembering something, had basically his hippocampus, the memory section of his brain, inserted into his anus. Bonus points for that one, because that was certainly grotesque and definitely gave me a much-deserved chuckle. So that's pretty much my thoughts on this week's Psycho-Pass. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of this episode and the overall arc for these last three. And otherwise, that'll be it for me on this one, so I'll catch you later. Peace.